All right. It's better if I'm not that particularly sharp focused. All right. It's like, no, whatever. I'd just rather be closer to this is a better group dynamic. Are we good? Are we live? All right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. We did a little, schedule change at the last minute because Chris Roberts had some flight delay this morning. He is on his way, and he's promising to stop at a liquor store because he owes me, but I took his slot. Name of the talk is More Tales from the CryptAnalyst. My name is Jeff Mann. There's my contact information. If you're interested, I repeated at the end, if you're still interested. I got a lot to get through this morning, so I'm going to apologetically talk very quickly. Just very quickly, I work for a company called Online Business Systems. They pay my way to come out here and speak at conferences, so I like to give them a nod because they're very appreciative of me doing this, and I'm very appreciative of them letting me. So please give Online a quick round of applause, if you would, please. Thank you. We do consulting. We do security consulting in the compliance field. We have security testers. We have managed security services. We're always hiring. If anybody's interested, I'm happy to pass your name along. That's all I'll say about them. I've been in the information security field for about 37 years. This is my background. A good chunk of that, my formative years, were at NSA, the National Security Agency, which is kind of what this talk's about today. I do want to apologize because as I was putting this talk together and trying to make it interesting and trying to find cool screenshots for the slides, I realized back in the day, and we're going back into the early to mid 90s, this is how we took screenshots. So please bear with me if the graphics aren't up to the usual caliber of a con talk. I'm going to try to involve you guys today and interject some important dates in history. This is a little bit of audience feedback, audience participation. We're going to try it out real quickly. A date flashes on the screen. You get to shout out why this date is important in history. Anyone know? Anyone have any idea? I'm not going to give you a whole lot of time to think because I got a lot of slides to go through. Give up? Wait for the laugh track. All right. Another thing I'm throwing in this talk today because I had this idea a couple weeks ago, and I knew Circle City Com was going to be doing the mental health hackers here. Something that's really important. I'm sure we've all known people that have had struggles in this industry, some very severely and some very permanently. So I wanted to, as I was going through this talk, I'm going to interject, and I don't know when because I threw in the slides yesterday, and I don't have my crux of seeing what the next slide is, but there's going to be some occasional slides when they pop up. I'll tell you why. So just be on the lookout. The nature of this talk, originally there was a Tales from the CryptAnalyst talk, and this is all about the 10 years that I spent at NSA from 1986 to 1996. While I was there, primarily, or a good chunk of the time, I was a cryptanalyst, a cryptographer. I actually worked on both sides, offense and defense, as it were, and also got into, which is the crux of this talk, doing security testing, penetration testing, vulnerability assessments. The original talk, Tales from the Crypt, I went through the first several years of my career, and I sort of had 3 different careers at NSA, 3 different duty stations, if you will. Very quickly, the first couple years at NSA, just a recap in case you haven't seen the original talk, I was a cryptographer on the InfoSec side of the house working in the manual crypto systems branch. We produced paper products, primarily one-time pads. One of my customers very early on asked me, hey, it takes us hours to write out these messages, encrypting them and decrypting them with a one-time pad, but we've got this computer sitting on the desk. Couldn't we use that to do the encryption, decryption? And I thought, sure, why not? That seems reasonable. It's not a complicated algorithm. You just need to have the key. So I ended up producing what, to my knowledge, is the first software-based crypto system that NSA produced. which was no small feat, and I share that because at NSA at the time, in the InfoSec was responsible at NSA for producing all the cryptographic equipment that was used by the U.S., the military, the government, and it was all boxes. It was all hardware. In fact, I had a chief scientist say to me one time, "There's no such thing as software. It's really all hardware." So, thinking about this talk, which ultimately is about the beginning of hacking and pen testing at NSA, I thought back to this incident, and I thought, I didn't think about it at the time, but I was really hacking the system because I had to take requirement specs that were written for hardware and sort of jerry-rig them and rewrite them to make them make sense for software. So that was sort of one of my formative experiences early on. I also had a customer that used a one-time pad with the algorithm that they use for encryption and decryption was 26 offsets of the alphabet reversed. It's called a Visionaire table or a Visionaire square. They memorized the algorithm, which the table actually produces unique three-letter combinations. I did not have them memorized, so I just made this little simple aid to help me do the encryption and decryption process. And they liked it so much we ended up making like 15,000 of them. I gave this talk a little while ago at CypherCon, and a good friend of mine came up to me, who happens to be in the room. I don't know, William, if I should say your name or not, but he asked me, "Have you ever heard about this Diana crypto system that the Special Forces use?" And I'm like, well, that name doesn't sound familiar to me, but I Googled it, and I found this site, and I thought to myself, gee, that looks really familiar. I told William, I said, "Do you know I'm the guy that invented it?" So long story short, I got in touch with this guy that was making these wooden versions of my Visionaire wheel, and he was so happy to hear hear from the inventor and hear the real story about how it came about. He sent me a bunch of these wooden crypto puzzles. You can go on Etsy and find this guy. They're really cool puzzles. I forgot to put them in my bag, otherwise I would have shared them with you. But we had a really good conversation via email. My ultimate goal is I want to make sure that this gets into the National Cryptologic Museum because there's not a lot of InfoSec history at the National Cryptologic Museum. And as far as I know, the Special Forces used these wheels for about 10 years, at least 10 years. So they remembered it, and somebody thought it should be memorialized in wood, so why not? Put it in the museum. That's actually a picture of one of the production models. I have a prototype. I have it in my bag if anybody wants to see it. I carry it with me wherever I go because you never know when you need to encrypt with a one-time pad. One of my early bosses, he called me a loose cannon. Looking back on it, it's like, yeah, I had the hacker mentality even before I knew it. My second career, I became a Cryptanalysis Intern, and I went over to work on the operations side of the house, and I happened to be there during the first Gulf encounter, which was called Desert Shield, Desert Storm. So not a whole lot on that, but that's just a quick recap of what I did in my early days, or my formative years at NSA. Ultimately, I was certified as a cryptanalyst at NSA. That's really the only certification I carry to this day. Which leads me into the crux of this talk, which is the last chapter of my time at NSA, which started as my last tour as an intern. I went back to InfoSec, and I ended up working for an office called Fielded Systems Evaluation. Fielded Systems Evaluations was interesting because somebody had the brilliant idea that NSA had a reputation for producing all the crypto, and we produced the best crypto, the best little black boxes in the world. They were unbreakable, they were perfect, everything worked fine. But somebody realized, well, the way that we were very often successful on the operations side of the house was we were able to read communications from adversaries and from foreign countries because the people that used them did silly things like they didn't change default settings, or they found bypasses around the crypto. Or even something like a one-time pad, which, as the name implies, you use the key one time, but for conservation efforts or whatever reason, every once in a while somebody might use a page of key, maybe for a day, maybe for a week, maybe for a month. I guess they thought they were saving paper. When you do that, you introduce vulnerabilities, which makes the underlying message ultimately solvable. That's a lot of what cryptanalysis is. So somebody had the idea of, well, gee, if we're doing it to them, how do we know they're not doing it to us? So there was this whole office that was looking at how our systems were being used in the field. So it was a lot of observation, looking at the way the 18, 19, 20-year-old communications combo soldiers were using the things in the field. This is one of the devices that I was actually working on from an evaluation perspective. Not that that's a big deal, but that's really what I was working on. Another date. This is a date that changed history. Anybody have an idea what it is? Going once, going twice? Clipper chip, no. This is the day that gave us all our occupation. The day that the internet became popular and public. The day that Mosaic came out. And that's actual, this is that screenshot thing. That's actually what the first Mosaic browser looked like. Anybody remember this thing? Few people. You're old like me. And then, as soon as the internet became popular, what came along? Hackers, people that were trying to figure out how to break it, people that were figuring out how to use the hidden features and not so hidden features. Back in those days, I think it was interesting, it's interesting to me at least, in the early days we called it internet security. Nowadays we call it that ugly C word that a lot of us don't like. But in the beginning, the idea was organizations, primarily governments and research universities and military contractors, that's who was using the internet back then, they were talking amongst themselves, but it wasn't terribly public. But when the general masses came on board, the belief was, well, everybody's got networks and computers already. All we have to do is protect it from the evil internet. So it was all about creating a barrier, creating a perimeter, and much like military tactics, if we just build a wall, like a firewall, we'll be safe. Here's one of these insertions. I want to just interject while I'm going through this talk. I asked my wife she does scrapbooking and does a lot of photo albums, which I'm very grateful for, but I want to just interject, while I was doing all this stuff at NSA, I also had a life. One of the benefits of working for the government was mostly had a 9-to-5 job. So, while I was getting into fielded systems evaluations and ultimately getting into hacking at NSA, I was also married, buying a house, raising children. So these are just some shots. First and foremost, I'm a dad. I'm a husband. I have a family. That's me with hair and me without a beard. And back in the early days, I grew my hair long, what was left of it, and that's almost like a mullet. I probably shouldn't have put that picture up there. I'm sorry. But anyway, there was a small group of us in this office doing fielded systems evaluations that started focusing on what we called at the time networked systems. And one of our great inspirations was a book that was out at the time called The Cuckoo's Egg. Anybody ever read the book, heard of the book? If you haven't read it, I encourage you to find it and get a copy. It's a story of this guy, and this actually happened, Cliff Stahl's his name. In 1986, he actually discovered, I'll make a long story short, no spoilers, but he was working for a university and figured out that bad guys had broken into the university systems to steal government secrets, and he was able to track them down and figure out and find them, and they were ultimately exposed. I forget whether they were prosecuted or not, because they were spies after all. I bring this up because this really was a motivation, and also because just a little while ago, I actually got to meet Cliff Stahl. I was at a conference in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and he's as zany as he comes across if you've ever seen videos of him or seen him live. But it was a fanboy moment for me. One of my early inspirations. I actually got to meet and we got to hang out. Anyway. Back at NSA, management got a hold of things and started learning, there's this thing going on called hacking and computer security and internet security, and what the government likes to do very often is reorganize. So they reorganized and they formed an organization that was called the Systems and Network Attack Center, and I became a part of that. We were designed to be, Chris made it, everybody say hi, Chris. There's cups in the back, and I am thirsty.
Do you want Irish or do you want proper Highland?
Proper, please. So this organization was organized as a center of excellence, and it was designed to be, because the government management has to put their fingers on it. We were going to go real deep. We're the best in the world at crypto. We're in the best of the world at everything else. So we might as well be the best of the world at doing all this computer security, internet type of security stuff. There was a group of us that we got together and we said we're gonna learn how to hack. We're gonna learn how to break into systems. We're gonna learn how to break into networks, and it's all sorts of fun. Management had a different vision. They just figured all we need is a bunch of these smart guys, and we'll be better than the whole world. Well, I don't care how good you are. If you get 10, 20, 50 people together, you're not going to compete against the world where there's hundreds and thousands of people out there doing all this stuff. And that's proven true, I think. But this was sort of the mentality that we were up against from the very beginning. Cheers.
Thank you. Excelente. That's the rest of it.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
This is why you should always pay it forward and occupy time slots in a pinch. I don't even really care if I finish my talk now, but you do. So there was a small group of us that got together. At the time, the organization that sort of owned the internet or owned the network for the DoD was the Air Force. They were responsible for making it run, and they were the first group that put together what was, a security operations center, a SOC. They were the first ones that started getting into how do you detect bad things that are happening on the network. So we decided to go learn from them. We wanted to see what they were doing, get set up. So we took a road trip. We went to meet some of these guys. These were some of our early mentors. I'll just have to tell you their names. The person on the left, Captain Zeiss, he unfortunately passed away about 2 years ago. And on the right, Captain Waddell. I actually had a chance to talk to him as I was putting this talk together, and we reminisced over old times. They were putting together what was essentially the first SOC, and like many government employees did back in the day, they went out and formed a company. Anybody ever hear of the Wheel Group? They lasted all of about, 18 months? And they were quickly acquired by a company that is known, world over as being a security company. Anybody know what company acquired them? Cisco. Trivia. That's all I'm full of. So we took a trip. They were down in San Antonio. We took a trip to San Antonio. They were at an Air Force base, so we got to see cool sights because we were, vacationing a little bit. It was a boondoggle. Those are actually some of the guys that I worked with there. The SR-71 spy plane that had only been recently declassified, so that was the first time we got to see one for real. That plane was primarily responsible for winning Desert Storm so quickly. I think it's the A-10 Warthog. Of course, we saw the sights. We saw the Alamo. San Antonio is a really cool river walk, and if you go to the river walk, and this is very important in hacker lore, we discovered the 46-ounce margarita. And I recommend if you're going to do any kind of security testing, penetration testing, hacking, whatever we call this stuff, obviously alcohol is involved. Another excursion. I took vacations with my family. It wasn't all work. I put this particular slide here because I remember being in San Antonio, calling my wife to see how she was doing because I had just finished like a 25-ounce steak dinner and then was drinking this 46-ounce margarita, and she was telling me about how she had split a can of tuna with her and the 4 kids. And I'm like, well, I'll make sure I'll take you on a vacation. So work-life balance, I didn't always do it well, but I always tried to make up for it. So remember, work-life balance. Our biggest takeaway, what we took, other than, smart guys, but, we kind of knew what they did in terms of the technical methodologies and things like that, what we had learned at the time. But they had an office structure that wasn't just cubicle after cubicle. They had pushed their cubicles to the corners and literally had a round table. So we recreated that in our new office in the SNAC. And the idea was if anybody was working on a project and had a question or had a problem and they needed help, They would simply, any one of us could simply call round table. We'd all drop what we were doing, literally just spin our chairs, come to the middle, and we'd collaborate and try to figure out the problem. It was a great way to work collaboratively back in the days when people worked in offices. We very quickly realized that we didn't fit in with everybody else, so we tried to create our own space and our own personalities. We were trying to live the hacker methodology. Excuse me a minute. It occurred to me I should actually drink this. And this is sort of the story of what came to be known as the pit. As part of the reorganization, we moved locations. These are office buildings that are just outside, just west of BWI Airport in Maryland. And when we moved into our office, part of like the living the hacker culture was we decided to give our office a nickname, and we called it the Pit. And the Pit was simply what we called our office. It was located in this particular building, in that particular corner, and I think it was on the second or third floor. It's been a few years. You can drive by these buildings today. They still exist. Why I bring this up is a couple years ago, a book came out called Dark Territory. Has anybody read this book, heard of this book? Recommended reading. In this book, there was a chapter called Eligible Receiver, which I'll get to later, what the title means. And in that chapter, one of the members of the Pit got the book and read it and then emailed all of us and said, "Hey, we're in a book." So I like to do it as a dramatic reading for you, but in the middle it says, during its most sensitive drills, the red team worked out of a chamber called the Pit, which was so secret that few people at NSA knew it existed, and even they couldn't enter without first passing through 2 combination locked doors. Well, that was very impressive and kind of accurate. We did work in an office. We called it the Pit. And it didn't have 2 locked doors, though. I don't know where that came from. But apparently, somehow, my humble beginnings as a hacker pen tester at NSA somehow grew into folklore that made it into a book. So that should be everybody's aspiration, is to make it into a book someday. The Pit, although that's what we called our office, it was really 6 guys, and we were all just trying to figure out the stuff that we're still trying to figure out today. It was just a group of guys that were trying to be hackers and trying to make the world better by breaking into things and telling our customers how to prevent the bad guys from breaking in. One thing that we discovered, though, was nobody had ever really done this before in an organized fashion. So there wasn't SANS courses to take. There weren't SANS instructors in the room listening to you give this talk. So we had to kind of figure things out for our own selves, and so we had to come up with methodologies. But while we were doing that, of course, we still had management oversight, and management sometimes had different ideas, which that's what management has to do. And they had some concerns, and there was sort of 2 primary concerns. One that came more of an issue later on, but it's simply, the whole issue that NSA does what NSA does to foreign countries and persons and not U.S. citizens. The other one was more political in nature of NSA had never done something like this before. It was new and different, and maybe some of the managers, hacking was just kind of mysterious, and they didn't understand it. So they wanted us to follow rules, and in a bureaucracy, rules are time-consuming, and so one of the biggest problems was if we wanted to do some sort of a test against a target, against a customer, we had to go through all sorts of bureaucratic permission gathering, which back in those days was done on paper. And so paper had to pass from desk to desk to desk, secretary to manager, and it would often literally take a month for us to get permission to do what it was that we were itching to do. And to be quite honest, might have already done, but nobody knew it because there was no such thing as intrusion detection back then. But anyway, we came up with methodologies. We started out by doing reconnaissance. We wanted to know our target. We wanted to figure out what we had to work with, what was out there. We called it recon. These days, you might be more familiar with the term OSINT, or open source intelligence. It's essentially the same thing. we would do our initial discovery, doing some sort of network probing, and find out the targets, find out what they were, what ports and services they were talking on, things like that. What kind of, if it was on a network, we'd find out trust relationships, find out basically whatever we could find in terms of what our target was, so we could develop an attack strategy, and then execute the attack, and have lots of fun, and get giddy when we got root, or to use the vernacular of the day, pop a shell, and then we report our findings and move on. Hasn't really changed a whole lot today. You teach the methodology. Has it changed a whole lot? Not a whole lot. We didn't invent it. We just, there's a right way to do it, and there's a methodical way to do it, but it hadn't been written down at that time, so we just kind of had to come up with it on our own. What I want to impress upon you, though, and this is a little bit of the history lesson, is we didn't have all the tools that you guys have available today. All these things didn't exist, or we didn't have access to. Even something as fundamental as Nmap, and I had to stop and check myself when I was putting together this talk to find out, when did Nmap come out? And it came out after I had left NSA. Another interjection, while we're having fun working, I still went home and got involved in family activities and carving pumpkins and all that kind of stuff. Those are my kids. They're all grown up now. I want to share with you a little bit about what, I've told you what we didn't have. Now I want to share a little bit about what we did have in terms of our tradecraft. And I do have to give a disclaimer here. An additional burden that we had, or challenge that we had, is the way NSA rules worked was, if we were targeting a system, anything that we did to that system, no matter how benign, had to be classified at the level of the system that we were targeting. So, in trying to tell you what stuff we were using back then, what I will say is, I'm not going to tell you what we were using necessarily. I'm going to tell you what was commonly available at the time. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. You with me? All right. So we had these things called network sniffers. They were appliances, they were hardware, they weighed 20, 30 pounds. We would roll them around on a cart and plug them into a network. Prior to Ethernet, there was other types of network cables, and we had to have the right attachments. They were quite cumbersome, but they were quite useful. We had available to us at some point early vulnerability scanning tools. Satan being one of the first ones. Anybody remember Satan? Satan is actually still out there somewhere. I should put the URL up on this sometime. You can download it. I don't know if you can get it to run on anything, because you have to actually compile the code. Does anybody do that anymore? I don't know, but it's out there. One of the things I do as an aside is I'm a host on Security Weekly, in case you didn't know that. We had a chance to interview the authors of Satan I think it was last November or December. Does it say there? You can look it up on YouTube. It's episode 584. I've had a lot of fanboy moments in the last year. This was another one of them, because I got to meet the guys that wrote Satan. They were like, that's the original tool that we got to use. Great guys, great conversation. I think that's one of our best interviews that we've done. Another date. Anyone? I've been stumping everyone so far. Something called BugTrack came out in 1993. It's that old. It was later taken over by LF1 in 1996, but it's been around since 1993. How many years is that? 26 years. Netscape bugs. So some of you might be asking, what is BugTrack? And we'll get to that. Right after we take a dip in the pool. Remember, work-life balance. Don't always hack. Take time out to have a life. This is an example of BugTrack. What BugTrack was a way to report vulnerabilities and issues with software and code and hardware and whatever you were dealing with. And it was done pretty much by a mailing list, email. There used to be this thing called email that people would communicate with. And so, you would write a question, send it to the group, and hopefully somebody would be familiar with the problem and could answer, or give you guidance. or they might be interested and do some research, and you could work collaboratively. And in the very beginning, I don't remember that it was very particularly searchable, but people would gather all the bug track data and eventually put it into searchable databases where you could, if you wanted to investigate a particular topic or a particular system or application, you could do that. There was also organizations that would public advisories. If they saw hacker activity, bad guy activity, they'd report about them. Computer emergency response teams. I don't know if you can read that. If you get down there, there should be a chuckle at some point. This is a bona fide cert advisory that was released on July 4th, 1996. 1996, it's kicking in. And it's all about malware that could affect alien spaceships, which is the plot of how we won the day on Independence Day. So back then, certs had a sense of humor. They had time for a sense of humor. I mentioned reconnaissance. We did open source collection. Back in those days, I said we didn't have all the stuff we have available to us now. We had some rudimentary search databases that were available. They were mostly searching databases because that's where information was kept. Large mainframes had large databases at large universities, and they would set up very rudimentary search engines that you could use, things like Archie. You also, back then, every IP address for every system was internet routable. We didn't do net masking then. If you wanted to be on the internet, you had to purchase or lease IP address space, class A's, B's, C's, subnets, and everything had an address. So you could look up, if you had a target that was xyz.gov, since this was in the military at the time, or .mil, you could look up and see what xyz.mil owned in terms of address space, and that would help you figure out what your targets were going to be. Gopher is another search engine. We didn't have Google, but a kick-ass search engine back in the day was something called Alta Vista. It was light years ahead of its time, and it was built on systems that were quicker than any other systems. And then, of course, we had the good old Netscape Navigator, Netscape browser, where you could start to do, things over the web rather than things over these. Most of these other search engines like Gopher and Archie, they were command driven from a shell, where you were doing something like telnetting to a database. And then, of course, the original Yahoo. Anybody remember the original Yahoo? One of the features was they had a button. I forget what it looked like, and I don't have a picture of it, but there was somewhere on it was like, because nobody was on the internet back then and web browsing was kind of new, they had kind of a roulette button where you could click and just go to a random website, because they just wanted people to experience the internet, go and search what's out there, discover. It was wonderful. We would acquire targets using things, again, we didn't have Nmap, so we had something called Strobe. Strobe was a tool that was written that would do TCP port scanning, so you could figure out what services are live, what systems are out there. You'd figured out the address space, so now you could figure out how you were going to get to it. Trivia quiz. Anybody know who wrote Strobe? I didn't remember it either until I saw the name. Strobe was actually written by Julian Assange. I don't know why that's interesting. When I was looking up and doing the research and I saw that, I'm like, that's why the guy's name sounds familiar, because every time you would launch Strobe, a little, welcome to Strobe version whatever, written by Julian Assange. It's like, I knew that guy's name sounded familiar. Other search engines, looking up domain registrations and, people with name systems and things like that. And of course, NS lookup, which again, nothing was private. Everything was everything was addressable and reachable. And so a name service lookup. Here's the IP address. What's the name of the system that's using that IP address? We had rudimentary network mapping tools, and it was kind of fun. Didn't really give you a whole lot, but it gave you an idea of sort of the topology sometimes. Another date. Anyone? At least somebody's guessing. First time the pants came down and the crack came out. Crack is an early password cracking tool. One of the things we did back then, was crack passwords, and that was a way to get into systems. Of course, that problem's been solved, and passwords are no longer an issue. Back in those days, passwords were kept with user IDs in something called the Etsy password file. There was no shadowing, there was no hiding them. I've blacked out real people's names, but those are the user IDs, and then a colon, and then a hash, which is the password. So you could copy these files and run crack and figure out how, guess what all the passwords were. It was originally designed to be used by system administrators to make sure users were using good passwords, not easily guessable or breakable passwords. But again, passwords have been solved now, so this is just ancient history. One of the common techniques back in the day of how we would break into primarily Unix systems was to find applications and services that were running on the Unix system running with something that was called setuid. Setuid meant that the program, even if you, a mere user, executed the program, it would run as the owner of the program, which very often was the root account. And what you could do with that, if you found a program like this, if you could get it to hiccup, if you could get it to halt execution, very often it would exit in the state of the ownership that it had. So a very common way of getting a root shell was just to find one of these scripts and figure out how to get a way to alter. Hold on. It's making it better already. Figure a way to halt the execution, it would drop you in a root shell, you were done. You had root. So that's kind of a very, very, very quick rudimentary snapshot of what we had to work with, what we were dealing with in terms of the tools and the tradecraft. So I wanted to share a little bit of our growing pains. I mentioned this very early on. I'll go into a little bit more detail. We had this sort of overarching challenge that NSA doesn't do what NSA does to U.S. citizens. And of course, the idea of testing systems, you're testing U.S. systems. So there were some people that had concern about that, but there were ways around, not getting around the law, but there were ways to meet the laws, but do it in a way where everybody was aware, and that's why we took a month to get permissions to do things. Another date, PGP. PGP was revolutionary, and it was very scary for NSA because it was free encryption. Phil Zimmerman, in fact, got into a lot of trouble because back in those days, crypto was classified as munitions and therefore not exportable to foreign powers. And then PGP comes along, free to everybody. The U.S. government, tried to prosecute him for years for violating, basically committing espionage by allowing munitions to be exported outside of the U.S. But I have a different story to tell about PGP. PGP was impactful to NSA because we built the crypto for our customers, which was the armed forces. There was a day when one of the branches of the military came to our management and said, "Why are we spending millions of dollars for NSA to develop something to secure our email communications? Why can't we just use this PGP thing? It's free." So there was this literal hands-on deck call from our highest levels of management. Everybody was supposed to drop what they were doing, and everybody was supposed to work on coming up with an attack against PGP. A group of guys that actually worked in the office next to ours, or across the hallway from us, came up with a very clever attack against PGP. And they were hailed as heroes. They were given all sorts of cash awards. They were taken down to D.C. and the Pentagon and had to do briefings about this wonderful attack that they came up with. Let me tell you about what the attack real quickly. I learned about it some months afterwards, where they did like a brown bag lunch and learn just for us minions that worked with them. They described how they took I want to say at the time it was WordStar, which was our word processing document application at the time. They found some unused byte space in the document, and they were able to insert some code in that document that would extract the public and private key rings that PGP relies upon and attach it to a document and email it out the next time. So all they had to do was send this email as an attachment to somebody, get them to click on it and open it. It would launch the attack, and they would steal the key rings. PGP is broken. Does this sound familiar to anyone? What did I just describe? A phishing attack, right? This was like 1995. So if you think phishing attacks are new, I beg to disagree with you. When I heard this lunch briefing and they described this to them and they got to the Q&A time, I raised my hand. I said, wouldn't this attack work against our stuff too? And they kind of stopped and thought and said, yeah, it probably would. And I said, then why are we making such a big deal out of this? And they got very indignant and said, well, we were tasked with breaking PGP, not our own stuff. I'm like, okay, whatever. I actually, again, another fanboy moment, I got to meet Phil Zimmerman last fall. I was down in Atlanta at the ISSA International Conference, and I got to tell him that story. He got a kick out of it. So we're buds now, too. I've met all my heroes now, I think. So let me share. I said I wasn't going to share any of this top secret stuff we did, but I do want to share one with you. So, let's not let this leave this room, except for it's being recorded. I'm going to share some of our top secret tradecraft. Are you ready for it? This was our primary attack tool.
I like that you stopped to take a drink. But that's...
It's that whole pause for effect. Imagine a world where you have to wait a month to get permission to issue a ping command. And imagine how that didn't sit well with us. So what we had to do was start working with our lawyers, our general counsel, because they were the ones that were not making the rules, but they were enforcing the rules or helping us to find ways to work within the boundaries that we had been provided. And their original idea was, well, just tell us ahead of time all the different tricks and techniques and tools you use, and we'll kind of pre-approve them so that when you have a job come up, you'll just sort of click through an a la carte menu and tell us, we're going to do a couple pings and we're going to do a couple of this and a couple of that, and we know what those are, and so we'll approve it much more quickly. And for some reason, I was the one that either volunteered or got stuck with working with the lawyers. I think it's because I have a brother that's a lawyer, and I felt like I could speak their language. So I ended up working with the lawyers and trying to explain to them that, it's not that simple because it's a very imprecise science. This is an art form. You don't know what you're going to do until you encounter what you encounter, and you're not going to know what you're encountering until you start probing and looking at it. And of course, ping was considered, the reason why it was considered top secret was it was ruled by the lawyers to be an active attack because it elicited a response from the target. So that was the mentality that we were walking into. They had their ideas, we had our ideas. What I ended up doing was we ended up meeting on a weekly basis. This was a popular TV show at the time, Home Improvement. And the show within the show was called Tool Time. So I started a weekly meeting with the general counsel, just teaching them all about our tradecraft and all about the things that we did, and just sort of debunking and demystifying this thing called network security or internet security, which was really just teaching them how to use Unix and teaching them about, things like file permissions and things like trust relationships, which was basically just how Unix worked. But it was magical to him. It was eye-opening. And in fact, we were on networks within a network, and we were on subnetworks that were supposedly isolated. But very often I would demonstrate the violation of trust by modifying his file right in front of him, his login file, so that I could gain access later, and then would do things to him for a week and then come back and show him. But one of the most eye-opening things for him was we looked at his simple directory structure and things that he had in terms of work product as a lawyer that he thought was super secret that nobody could see. Very often were in world-readable directory files that anybody in the whole organization could look at. That was eye-opening for him. And while I was doing all that, I still did stuff with family. Word got out. We were doing this fun stuff. At first it was NSA only, and it was within the DoD community. The armed forces were doing it. And I don't really remember the details, but somehow other agencies found out. So we were approached by by the Department of Justice. This is actually a clip of an article that came out a couple years after I left that talks about what I'm about to describe to you. But basically, we were approached by the Department of Justice. They wanted us to look at their internet presence and do what we were calling a vulnerability assessment or a vulnerability and threat assessment against their internet presence. Of course, we had to go to the lawyers because, we're not supposed to do that to U.S. citizens, and especially not unclassified systems. NSA was allowed to do what NSA did traditionally to classified systems. The organization that was responsible for unclassified systems at the time was NIST, but it was well understood at the time that NIST didn't have the capability, that they didn't have anyone that had the chops. Nobody was doing this at NIST. So it was very common, we learned through the lawyers, that NIST would sort of, do a little handoff to NSA asking for a special favor. Anyway, I went to the lawyer and learned what the rules were, and basically it said, well, it needs to be a cabinet level sort of personal favor from the Department of Justice through the Department of Defense. So a letter came from addressed to the person responsible for this stuff, which was an Assistant Secretary of Defense at the time, and it actually was signed by the Attorney General at the time, Janet Reno, and it said, hey, could you do that cool stuff that those kids are doing at NSA to us, please? And I was working with, it was like a 3 months process to get all these, memos written. I don't know if you know it, but, the people that write these letters, they don't write them. They're written by the lawyers and people that work for them, and it all gets negotiated down to every jot and tittle and word. And ultimately was signed by our director going back to say, yeah, we'd be happy to do this. You can see my name is listed as the point of contact. I kept all this information because you should always keep things in writing that are kind of edgy. Right before we got a chance to do it, this thing happened. This was the first hack of a government website. It was a big deal back in the day, although in the grand scheme of things, all they did was website defacement. They didn't steal personal data. They didn't find out any deep secrets about what the Department of Justice was doing. And we could go off on a tangent there, but we won't. What it was at the time was, the Department of Justice, which had their own network, which had their own internet-facing systems, and they'd set up their own web server. It was defaced by hackers, and they discovered this over a weekend. And of course, what do you do when your system has been compromised? You pull the plug, you wipe it, and you start over. But I got a call from the guy that I'd been working with on a Monday morning, and he said, help. And so I set out to find out how to help them. So a group of us from the pit went down to DC. We spent a couple days with them. I'm making a long story short, but we were there for about 3 days. We weren't finding a whole lot. There were no forensics courses. There were no forensics methodologies at the time. So we were kind of the first thing we learned was, you destroyed all the evidence, so we really don't have anything to look at. But there were some other, devices on the network, other systems that we were looking at. But we were there for about 3 days when I got a call from somebody who had stayed behind at the pit that said, the shit's hit the fan. You guys got to drop everything and just come back now. And so we dropped everything. We went back. We were escorted into the deputy director of NSA's conference room, and the lawyer that I'd been working with for the previous year proceeded to read us the Riot Act and tell us about how we had done all sorts of illegal things because we were doing things to unclassified systems and we're not supposed to, and NSA isn't supposed to do what NSA does to U.S. citizens, and we were doing it, and we hadn't gone through the right procedures and rules. Trust me, I'd gone through the procedures and rules. I had asked the general counsel, what do I need to do to get there? But somebody in the executive management chain somewhere got their nose out of joint and blew the whistle on it. It became a big deal. I do a whole talk on this, but the bottom line was they tried to get us in trouble, and because I was the ringleader, they tried to fire me, and they couldn't because every time I interviewed somebody from security, they said, "Really, that's it? That's what you were doing? You were just trying to help?" I was like, "Yeah," and then everybody dismissed it. It was traumatic for me at the time. But the upshot was, one of the things we learned was, and I became a contributor to one of the first SANS Institute documents on incident handling. I think they listed me as like an editor or reviewer. But it was, putting out the basic steps like don't destroy the evidence, pull the plug if you must off the internet, but preserve everything, take it offline so you can look at it. The upshot though was we were ultimately sort of vindicated, and we were escorted back into that conference room and talked to by senior management, and they said, look, we love what you guys are doing. And we'd love for you to do that here, but if you're going to do it here, you have to do it by our rules. So a lot of us just up and left, myself included. The 6 people that were originally members of the pit, 2 of them are still at NSA, 4 of us are out in private practice. The only other person that I'm allowed to say who was a member of the pit is Ron Gula. If you don't know Ron Gula, he was the founder of Tenable Network Security, the authors of Nessus. One of the other people out in public, he has on his LinkedIn profile that he did NSA pen testing, and I have yet to talk to him to include his picture on this slide, but I'm working on it. The 4th guy, very private guy, he'll never agree to be associated with any of us. But that's us. So, as an epilogue, we've all, many of us have been out in the private sector for many years. I won't even ask, nobody knows what this is, but going back to that book where they wrote about the pit, the chapter 4, which was eligible receiver. Eligible receiver happened from June 9th to 13th, about 3.5 days back in 1997. I left in October of 96. What eligible receiver was a joint NSA-wide hack of the DoD. It was designed and set up to be very clandestine, not anybody, very few people knew about it for any of the targets, any of the military services, and there was a lot of coordination with the Pentagon and so on and so forth. And it was designed to last, I think, for 14 days, and they had to cut it after 3 because they'd already owned everything. They talked about it, I guess it was on the 20th anniversary because it was in the fall of 2017. They did a symposium called Cyber at the Crossroads at the University of Maryland University College. And they got all the big, senior management types that were smarter than all of us actually doing the work to get together and talk about it. And, of course, I wasn't included. But what I did learn, and I think that website is still up there, although they've pulled down, like, the video recordings. I think the guy will email it to you on request. But they basically said none of the original members of the pit participated in the eligible receiver. One of the idea was they didn't want to have the uber elite hackers doing it. They wanted to have just sort of run-of-the-mill hackers. So they trained the B team to go out and do eligible receiver. So I don't know if I'm feeling honored by that or feeling snubbed. I haven't decided yet, but I was gone anyway. September 1st, 1997, that's when Nmap came out, for all of those that love Nmap. Those of us that were the original members of the pit, we still try to get together once or twice a year. It's usually over breakfast. One of our recent visits, one of the guys that still worked there, he brought some tchotchke for us. There's this place called the National Cryptologic Museum that's outside of Fort Meade, outside of NSA. I encourage you, if you ever come to Maryland, to visit it. They have a gift shop where you can get cool stuff like NSA secret sauce. Who doesn't want that? And you can get an NSA pen that projects a light signal, which is the NSA seal. So that's not a seal on a cup, that's a projection that's coming from that pen. They got t-shirts, they've got flasks, whiskey bottles, wine glasses, shot glasses, all sorts of fun stuff. And it all supports the Civilian Welfare Fund, which gives employees discount tickets to Orioles games. So that's it in a nutshell. I apologize for having to go through quickly. I mean, it was 3 years and lots of stories to tell. I'm going to be around all weekend. Happy to tell more stories, happy to go into more details. It'll only cost you a drink, possibly a cigar. If you're interested in learning more about me and the stories I tell, because I've been in this business forever, I mentioned I am one of the hosts on Paul's Security Weekly. Hack for Kids, anybody familiar with Hack for Kids? Yay. They put out a game called Freaker Life a year ago, and they let me be one of what they call the anachronisms, the face cards. That was most of us last year at Vegas getting together for a group photo. So I'm in a card game. Tribe of Hackers came out at the beginning of this year. I'm in that book. And if anybody happens to have a copy of that book with you, I'm happy to sign it for you. I have my Sharpies with me. I encourage you to get it. I am sometimes escorted by stormtroopers when I give talks, so I consider myself a Jedi Master. And 2 years ago, I was invited, and this is a semi-serious thing. People at RSA in San Francisco get together with Gene Spafford. Again, one of the those books that I showed you at the beginning. The Bible was Internet and Unix Security, written by Spafford. Spaff, as he's known to his friends. There's a small group of people, mostly old-timers, that go to dinner with him, and they call themselves the Cabal of the Curmudgeons. I was invited into that group 2 years ago, and the person that sort of sponsored me into the group is the guy on the end there in the red sweater that I had my arm around. He was the one that represented me into the group, and I was voted in, and once you're in for life. The guy that I have my arm around happens to be the lawyer that I worked with at NSA that I tried to teach pen testing and who ultimately tried to get me fired. Turns out, because we've talked, we didn't talk for probably 20 years, but I've gotten reacquainted with him, and it turns out he was taking a whole lot more shit than I was. He was providing a lot of cover. Because he originally, when we got back together, he said, "I forgive you," and I'm like, "Wait, I'm supposed to be forgiving you." Yeah, we're buds now. Any questions, comments? Chris, I don't know if I'm taking up your space, but you owe me anyway. I got time for one or two questions, comments, and then I'll turn the floor over to Chris, who is finally here. Otherwise, I'm here all weekend. Anyone? Yes. When did it all happen? It was like August of '96. Yeah. Any other questions? I mean, there's I forget the name of the website, but there's hacker archives out there. You can find it, and they have preserved the original website as well as the hacked website. It gets not suitable for working conferences if you scroll down on it. Any other questions, comments?
What was the name of the other team across the hall from you guys? You guys were the pick.
They didn't have a name. They didn't have an identity. They were just government weak wonks. They were computer scientists and engineers. Yes, ma'am.
What scotch do people buy from you?
Lafroig is good. I also like Lagavulin 16. And whatever Chris is packing, because he usually brings like 200 things to taste. But not today, because he was so rough. All right, I will yield the floor to the gentleman from Colorado. Thank you.